Problem definition, the foundation of business research. Chapter 6, Business Research Methods. After studying this chapter, we should be able to explain why proper problem definition is essential to useful business research, know how to recognize the problem, translate managerial decision statement into relevant research objective, translate research objective into research questions and/or research hypothesis, outline the components of a research proposal, and construct dummy tables as part of the research proposal. The opening example starts with the company Deal & Trucking. They have a recruitment problem. They are trying to find out why are their recruitment costs so high. So cost for driver selection and recruitment have not gone up, but the problem is that the company has to do so many orientation and hiring sessions. So the problem, does Deal & Trucking have a recruitment problem, or maybe it's a training problem? It's maybe the retention too low. Is the problem the company itself, or what is going on? So after examining the hiring worksheets, and if you compare the driver census figures for the last few months, well, yes, there is a problem, but you need to have the proper proposal in order to make sure that you're going to analyze the right problem for this example. The importance of starting with a good problem definition. The first stage of the research process introduced before involves translating the business decision situations into specific research objective. While it is tempting to skip this step and go directly to designing a research project, the chances that the research project will prove useful are directly related to how well the research objective corresponds to the true business problem. And in this chapter, we're gonna look how important this important step in the research process a little bit more closely. And translating a business situation into something that can be researched is somewhat like translating one language into another. It begins by coming to a consensus on a decision statement or question. A decision statement is a written expression of a key question that research users wish to answer. So it is the reason that research is being considered. It must be well stated and it must be relevant. As discussed in a previous chapter, the researcher translates this into research terms by rephrasing the decision statement into one or more research objectives. These are expressed as deliverables in the research proposal. And then the researcher then further expresses this in practice and scientific research terminology by creating research hypotheses from the research objectives. The term problem definition, I realized that sometimes this is really opportunity seeking rather than truly problem solving. Nonetheless, for simplicity, the term problem definition is adapted here to refer to the process of defining and developing a decision statement and the steps involved in translating it into more precise research terminology, including a set of research objectives. If this process breaks down at any point, the research will almost certainly be useless or even harmful. It will be useless if it presents results that simply are deemed irrelevant and do not assist in decision making. It can be harmful both because of the wasted resources and because it may misdirect the company in a poor direction. Finally, it's difficult to say that any one step in research process is most important. However, formally defining the problem to be attacked by developing decision statements and translating them into actionable research objective must be done well, or the rest of the research process is misdirected. Even a good roadmap is useless unless you know where you are going. All of the roads can be drawn correctly, but they still don't get you where you want to be. So similarly, even the best research procedures will not overcome poor problem definition. Defining problems can be difficult. This is the problem complexity. And the quality of the business research is limited by the quality of the problem definition stage. While certainly critically important to the success of the process, this is far from the easiest stage of the research process. In fact, it can often be the most complex one. And we see it in this picture here. Situation frequencies. Many business situations are cyclical, leading to recurring business problems, and these problems can even become routine. And in these cases, it's easy to define the problem and identify the types of research that are needed. In some cases, problems are so routine that they can be solved without any additional research, such when recurring problems can be automated to a company's decision support system. Dramatic changes as well. When a sudden change in the business situation takes place, it can be easier to define the problem. When changes are very subtle and take effect over a long period of time, it can be more difficult to define the actual decision and the research problems. So detecting trends that would permanently affect recruitment challenges, in the example with the deal and tracking phases, can be difficult, but it may be difficult to detect the beginning of such a trend, and even more difficult to know whether such a trend is permanent or simply a temporary one. Another problem, how widespread are the symptoms? The more scattered any symptoms are, the more difficult it is to put them together into some coherent problem statement. And companies may sometimes face situations in which multiple symptoms exist, but they are all pointing to the same specific business area usually. But when problems are more widespread, it can be very difficult to develop useful research questions. And if consumer complaints deal with the handling or the appearance of a car in a car dealership, and these were accompanied by symptoms including consumer beliefs that gas mileage could be better and that the dealership did not have a pleasant environment, it may be more difficult to put this scattered symptom together into one or a few relative research questions. As well, ambiguity is almost always unpleasant, and people simply are uncomfortable with uncertainty when it comes with ambiguity. An environmental scan of a business situation may lead to many symptoms, none of which seem to point into a clear and logical direction, and in this case the problem remains still vague, and alternative directions are difficult to ascertain. Good answers, bad questions. It's amazing, but sometimes even the most successful companies make huge research blunders, and these mistakes often are based on a misunderstanding of exactly what the brand and or the product means to the consumer. And some of the famous or infamous examples include the production of smokeless cigarettes, Ford's introduction of the Edsel in 1950s, and one of the most famous, or well, infamous, is Coca-Cola introducing the new Coke as a replacement for regular old Coke. So volumes have written about all these episodes, but then you wonder, how did these great companies do such an apparently dumb thing? And the blame is often placed at the foot of the decision makers. Research should have revealed that the product was a loser. So, however, researchers address the question they are asked to address by the management, but certainly the researchers play a role in framing any decision situation into something that can be addressed by a pointed research question, and the decision makers almost always start the process by asking the input from the staff or from the research consultants they have hired. So hopefully this dialogue that results will lead to a productive research question that will provide useful results. However, it was not always the case. And it's possible that even today some company would make a very similar mistake today, like Coke and Ford have done few decades ago. Now, the problem definition process. A problem occurs when there is a difference between the current condition and a more preferable set of conditions. In other words, a gap exists between the way things are now and the way that things could be better. The gap can come about in a number of ways. Business performance is worse than expected business performance. For example, sales, profit, marginal cost could be below target set by the management, or unemployee turnover is higher than expected, and this is a very typical type of problem analysis. Think of all the new products that fail to meet their target goals. Trend analysis would also be included in this type of problems, and management is constantly monitoring these key performance variables. Previous performance usually provide a benchmark forming expectations. Sales, for example, are generally expected to increase a certain percentage every year. So when sales fall below the expectations, or particularly when they fall below the previous year's sales, management usually recognize that they have a potential problem in their hand. Second, actual business performance is less than possible business performance, and realization of this gap first requires that management have some idea of what's possible. This may form a research problem in and of itself. Opportunity seeking often falls into this type of problem definition process, and many North American and European Union companies have defined that or what possible sales level are based upon the expansion of free markets around the world. And the third one, expected business performance is greater than possible business performance. Sometimes management has unrealistic view of possible performance level. One key problem with new product introduction involves identifying realistic possibilities for sale. While you may have heard the old adage that 90% of all new products fail, how many of the failures had a realistic sales ceiling? So in other words, did the company know the possible size of the market? The problem is not with the product, but maybe with the plan. And some product failures may actually have been successful if management had a more accurate idea of the total market potential. And management can close this gap through decision making. Poor question results in poor research in Japan. So French conglomerate BSN, this is Danone, the yogurt, is among the largest food manufacturers in the world. And when the firm noted that the Japanese were becoming more westernized, they decided to target Japan as a priority market for their yogurts. So the company knew better than to enter a new market without conducting marketing research. So they launched a market survey in Japan. The study reported that Japanese consumers were indeed becoming more westernized in their food choices and eating habits, and appeared to be offered a strong potential market for yogurts. So they rolled out the product in Japan, complete with extensive distribution and a well-financed promotional campaign. Sales, however, were disappointing and failing to meet companies' expectations. They conducted further research to understand what went wrong, and the follow-up research indicated that the yes-no question asked were too simplistic to actually gather accurate responses. So the Japanese consumer were simply too polite to say no to a question. So furthermore, the respondent did not want to offend the researchers by criticizing advertising featuring a spoon as an eating utensil. As a result, the data was very misleading and presented in an overly optimistic picture of the size, value, and the potential of the Japanese market for yogurts. The problem definition process. And here we have the six steps. You see, understand the situation and identify the key symptoms, identify the problems from the symptoms, write managerial decision statement and corresponding research objectives, determine the unit of analysis, determine relevant variables, and then write the research questions and or the research hypothesis. Understand the business decision. A situation analysis involves the gathering of background information to familiarize researchers and managers with the decision-making environment. And the situation analysis can be written up as a way of documenting the process definition process. Gaining an awareness of the relevant condition and an appreciation of the situation often requires exploratory research. Researchers sometimes apply qualitative research, as discussed in the next chapters, with the objectives of better problem definition, and the situation analysis usually begins with an interview between the researcher and the management. The interview process. The researchers must enter a dialogue with the key decision makers in an effort to fully understand the situation that has motivated a research effort. The process is critical, and the researcher should be granted access to all individuals who have specific knowledge of or insight into the situation. Researchers working with managers who want the information yesterday often get little assistance when they ask what are your objectives for this study. Nevertheless, even decision makers who have only a gut feeling that the research might be a good idea benefit greatly if they work with the researcher to articulate precise research objectives. Even when there is strong cooperation, seldom can a key decision maker express the situation in research terms. Researchers are often tempted to accept the first plausible problem statement offered by the management. Researchers may often be tempted to accept the first plausible problem statement offered by management. For instance, in the opening chapter with that trucking company, you believe that it's a recruitment problem. However, it is very important that the researchers not blindly accept a convenient problem definition for expediency's sake. And research demonstrates that people who are better problem solvers generally reject problem definition as given to them, and they take information provided by others and reassociate them with other information in a creative way. There are many ways to discover problems and spot opportunities, and often there is much art as science involved in translating scattered pieces of evidence about some business situation into relevant problem statement than relevant research objectives. While there are other sources that address creative thinking in details, some helpful hints that can be used in the interview process includes the following. Develop several alternative problem statements. This can emerge from the interview material or from simply rephrasing decision statement and the problem statement. The second, think about potential solution to the problem. And finally, for the research to be actionable, some plausible solution must exist. And after pairing decision statement with research objective, think about the solution that might result. And this can help make sure any research that results is really useful. Make a list. Use free association techniques to generate list of ideas, and at this stage of the research it's fair to say the more ideas the better. Use interrogative techniques to generate list of potential questions that can be used in the interview process. Interrogative questions simply involves asking multiple what, where, who, when, why, and how questions, and they can as well provoke introspection, which can assist with problem definition. And the last one, be open-minded. It's very important to consider all ideas as plausible in the beginning stages of the problem solving. And one sure way to stifle the progress is to think only like those intimately involved in business situations or only like those in other industries. Analogies can be useful in thinking more creatively. Identifying the symptoms and interrogative techniques I mentioned before use what, where, who, when, why, and different how questions about what has changed. An interview with the key decision makers can be one of the best ways to identify these key problems. And recall, all the problems have symptoms, just as human disease is diagnosed through symptoms. When symptoms are identified, then the researchers must probe to identify possible causes of the change. Probing is an interview technique that tries to draw progressively deeper and more elaborate explanation from the discussions, and these discussions may involve potential problem causes. And this probing process will likely be very helpful in identifying key variables that are prime candidates for the study. One of the most important questions a researcher can ask during the interview is what has changed, and then the researcher should probe to identify the potential causes of the change. At the risk of seeming repetitive, it's important that the researcher repeat this process to make sure that any important changes have not been left out. What has changed? And here we see some question. What changes have occurred recently? Tell me about these changes. What has brought this about? How might this be related to your problem? Or other questions. Yeah, what other changes have occurred recently? Competitors, customers, environment, pricing, promotion, suppliers, anything. But another example is about opportunity, is a fleeting thing. So non-European automotive company missed out on European opportunities. While Europe represents a nearly 15 million units annual market for new automobiles. But traditionally the thinking is that Europeans prefer smaller or lighter cars. So European car companies like BMW and Audi were slow to enter the SUV market. And Mercedes entered the SUV market rather early on, but the emphasis was on the American market. American and Japanese companies offer little more than a token effort at selling SUVs in Europe. So SUV war was fought in America, where the total volume reached 4 million shortly after 2000, and Europeans were left with fewer choices if an SUV struck their fancy. So the pre-2000 SUV sales in Europe were almost non-existent. However, SUV sales in Europe have increased dramatically since, and by 2004, about 1 in 20 of all new cars sold in Europe was an SUV. So Nissan, Toyota, Land Rover were all major players in the European SUV market. But sales expectation for new entries from Renault and Volkswagen and Mercedes and Audi were sluggish, even in 2010, with so many SUV to choose from, coupled with high fuel prices. In hindsight, could it be that several prominent car companies missed the opportunity in Europe because they failed to know how big the market truly was? But looking at this from the opposite direction, the tiny, by US standard, two-seater Smart car has been introduced to the US. Smart got off to a fast start in US, selling about 25,000 in 2008, and the sales fell, yeah, but Smart may now be poised to take advantage of an opportunity created by that expensive gas prices. A US producer as well, turning production away from large SUVs like the Hummer towards new entry like Chevy Volt. So this relative success of new entries against European minis like the Smart may as well depend on the exchange rate, which makes European entries expensive in the United States. But what is there may be even a Smart SUV, a miniature version of the American Icon? Well, so it's difficult to say what will be the Smart future. Writing managerial decision statement into corresponding research objectives. The situation analysis ends once researchers have a clear idea of the managerial objective from the research effort, and decision statement capture these objectives in a way that invites multiple solutions. And multiple solutions are encouraged by using plural nouns to describe solutions. A decision statement that says in what ways a problem can be solved is better than one that says in what way a problem can be solved. So finally, research may provide evidence showing results of several ways a problem can be attacked. Decision statement must be translated into research objectives, as the researcher is starting to visualize what will need to be measured and what type of study will be needed. The research objectives are deliverables of the research project, and the research study will be conducted that shows how much each of the several key variables relate to loyalty and retention for the first case, and provides a description of the likelihood of different intervention strategies on the driver satisfaction. Yeah, the example with the trucking that we started this chapter. So the researcher should reach a consensus agreement with the decision maker regarding the overall decision statement and research objectives. If the decision makers agree that the statement captures the situation well and understand how the research objective, if accomplished, will help address the situation, then the researcher can proceed. The researcher should make every effort to make sure that the decision makers understand what a research project can deliver. If there's no agreement on the decision statement on the research objectives, more dialogue between decision makers and researcher is needed. Determine the unit of analysis. The unit of analysis for a study indicates what or who should provide the data and at what level of aggregation. Researchers specify wherever an investigation will collect data about individuals, such as customers, employees, and owners, households, families, extended families, and so forth, organizations, businesses and business units, departments, sales, finance, geographical areas, or objects, product, advertisement. So, for example, for closing purchase, individuals are likely to be appropriate level of analysis. But in studies of home buying, however, the husband and wife, the family, typically is the best unit of analysis, since the purchase decision would be made jointly by the husband and the wife. So researchers who think carefully and creatively about situations often discover that a problem can be investigated at more than one level of analysis. So a lack of worker productivity could be due to problems that face individual employees, or it could reflect problems that are presented in an entire business unit. And determining the unit of analysis should not be overlooked during the problem definition stage of the research. Variables. What is a variable? What things should be studied to address a decision statement? And researchers answer these questions by identifying key variables. A variable is anything that varies or changes from one instant to another. Variables can exhibit differences in value, usually in magnitude or strength or in direction. In research, a variable is either observed or manipulated, in which case it is an experimental variable. The converse of a variable is a constant. A constant is something that does not change. Constants are not useful in addressing research questions. Since constants don't change, management isn't very interested in hearing the key to the problem is something that won't or can't be changed. In causal research, it can be important to make sure that some potential variable is actually held constant while studying the cause and effect between the two other variables. In this way, a spurious relationship can be ruled out. So at this point, the notion of constant is more important in helping to understand how it differs from a variable. Types of variables. There are several key terms that help describe the types of variable. The variance in variable is captured either with numerical differences or by an identified categorical membership. In addition, different terms describe whether a variable is a potential cause or an effect. We have continuous variables, is one that can take on a range of values that correspond to some quantitative amount. Consumer attitude toward different airlines is a variable that would generally be captured by numbers, with high numbers indicating a more positive attitude than lower numbers. A categorical variable is one that indicates membership to some group. The term classificatory variable is sometimes as well used and is generally interchangeable with categorical variable. Categorical variables sometimes represent quantities that take on only a small number of values, 1, 2, or 3. However, categorical variables more often simply identify membership. Dependent variable is a process outcome or a variable that is predicted and or explained by other variables. An independent variable is a variable that is expected to influence the dependent variable in some way. Such variables are independent in the sense that they are determined outside of the process being studied. And that is another way of saying the dependent variable does not change independent variables. Dependent variables are conventionally represented by the letter Y, and independent variables are conventionally represented by the letter X. So if research involves two dependent variables and two or more independent variables, subscript may as well use to indicate Y1, Y2, and then X1, X2, and so on. Writing research objectives and questions. Both managers and researchers expect problem definition efforts to result in statements of research questions and research objectives. At the end of the problem definition stage, the researcher should prepare a written statement that clarifies any ambiguity about what the research hopes to accomplish, and this completes the translation process. Research questions express the research objectives in terms of questions that can be addressed by research. For example, one of the key research questions involved in the opening vignette is, are wages along haul distance related to driver loyalty and retentions? Hypotheses are more specific than research questions. One key distinction between research questions and hypotheses is that the hypothesis can generally specify the direction of the relationship. So in other words, when an independent variable goes up, we have sufficient knowledge to predict that the dependent variable should as well go up or down, as the case may be. So the researcher may suspect that two variables are related but have insufficient theoretical rationale to support the relationship as positive or negative, and in this case hypothesis cannot be offered. In exploratory research, a proposal can only offer research questions, and research hypotheses are much more specific and therefore require considerably more theoretical support. Research questions are interrogative, whereas research hypotheses are declarative. Pricing turbulences. A heavy equipment distributor sought out research because it believed there was an opportunity to increase revenues by raising the prices. But after several weeks of discussion, interviews, and proposal reviews, they settled on a decision statement that asked, in what ways could revenue be increased by alerting pricing policies across customers? And the research project was conducted that offered the following deliverables to demonstrate how much customer characteristics and environmental characteristics influence the price elasticity, and identify market segments based on price elasticity. So the more critical a piece of heavy equipment is to a company, the less concerned they are with the price. So similarly, customers are less concerned with price in markets that are more turbulent, meaning they are ever-changing environmental, competitive, and political pressures. So interesting management did not express any concern about the market segments or market turbulence in the initial interviews, but the research succeeded because good research objectives and good questions and hypotheses were developed and before any study was implemented. Clarity in research questions and hypotheses. Research questions make it easier to understand what is perplexing manager and to indicate what issues have to be resolved. A research question is the research translation of the marketing problem. Research questions answers should provide input that can be used as a standard for selecting from among alternative solutions, and problem definition seeks to state research questions clearly and to develop well-formulated specific hypotheses. A sales manager may hypothesize that salespeople who show the highest job satisfaction will be the most productive, An advertising manager may believe that if consumers' attitude towards a product are changed in a positive direction, consumption of the product as well will increase. So hypotheses are statements that can be empirically tested. A formal hypothesis has considerable practical value in planning and designing the research. It forces researchers to be clear about what they expect to find through the study, and it raises crucial questions about the data. When evaluating a hypothesis, researchers should ensure that the information collected will be useful in decision making. Management is often faced with a go or no-go decision, and in such cases a research question or hypothesis may be expressed in terms of a meaningful barrier that represents the turning point in such a decision. And in this case, the research involves a managerial action standard that specifies a specific performance criterion upon which a decision can be based. If the criterion to be measured, for example, sales or attitude changes, turns out to be higher than some predetermined level, management will do A. If it's lower, management will do B. So research objectives also should be limited to a manageable number. Fewer study objectives make it easier to ensure that each will be addressed fully, and it becomes easy to lose focus with too many research objectives. How much time should be spent on problem definition? Like almost every other decision in business research, budget constraints usually influence how much effort is spent on problem definition. And business situations can be complex and numerous variables may be relevant. Searching for every conceivable cause and minor influence is impractical. The more important the decision faced by management, the more resources should be allocated toward problem definition. While not a guarantee, allowing more time and spending more money will help make sure the research objectives that result are relevant and can demonstrate which influences management should focus on. Managers being responsible for decision making may wish the problem definition process to be quickly, and researchers who take a long time to produce a set of research objectives can frustrate managers. However, the time taken to identify the correct problem is usually time well spent. Here we see the influence of decision statement of marketing problem on a research objective and project design. We have specific objectives, but we start from the statement, the problem, then the broad research objectives, the three objectives in this case, the research design, the results, and then again from the beginning if we need to improve something. The research proposal. The research proposal is a written statement of the research design, and it always includes statement explaining the purpose of the study in the form of research objectives or deliverable, and the definition of the problem, often in the form of a decision statement. A good proposal systematically outlines the particular research methodology and details procedure that will be used during each stage of the research process. Normally, a schedule of costs and deadlines is included in the research proposal. The research proposal becomes the primary communication document between the researcher and the research user. A proposal as a planning tool. Preparation of a research proposal forces the researcher to think critically about each stage of the research process, and vague plans, abstract ideas, and generalizations about problems or procedures must become concrete and precise statements about specific events. And data requirements or research procedures must be specified clearly so others may understand their exact implications. And all ambiguities about why and how research will be conducted must be clarified before the proposal is complete. The researchers submit the proposal to the management for acceptance, modifications, or rejections, and the research clients, the management, evaluate the proposal study with a particular emphasis on whether or not it will provide useful information and whether it will do so within a reasonable resource budget. Initial proposals are almost always revised after the first review. The proposal helps the manager to decide if the proper information will be obtained and if the proposed research will be accomplished what is desired. And if the problem has not been adequately translated into a set of specific research objective and research design, the client assessment of the proposal will help ensure the researchers revise it to meet the client's information needs. And an effective proposal communicates exactly what information will be obtained, where it will be obtained, and how it will be obtained. So for this reason, it must be explicit that some sample selection, measurement, fieldwork, and data analysis. For instance, most proposals involving descriptive research include a proposed questionnaire or at least some sample questions. The proposal as a contract: when the research will be conducted by a consultant or an outside research supplier, the written proposal serves as that person's bid to offer a specific service, and the client solicits several competitive proposals, and these written offers help the management judge the relative quality of the alternative research suppliers. A wise researcher will not agree to do a research job for which no written proposal exists. So the proposal as well serves as a contract that describes the product the research user will buy. And the proposal is in many ways the same as the final research report without the actual results. The proposal then functions as a formal written statement of agreement between the marketing executive and the researchers. In basic research effort, the formal proposal serves much the same purpose, and funded business research generally refers to basic research, usually performed by academic researchers and supported by some public or private institutions. Most commonly, researchers pursue federal government grants. A very detailed proposal is usually needed for federal grants, and the agreement for funding is predicated on the research actually delivering the results described in the proposal. The proposal and the final research report will contain much of the same information, and the proposal describes the data collection, measurement, data analysis, and so forth in future tense. And in the report, the actual results are presented. In this sense, the proposal anticipates the research outcomes. Using dummy tables. One such tool is perhaps the best way to let management know exactly what kind of results will be produced by research is the dummy table. And dummy tables are placed in research proposals and are exact representation of the actual tables that will show results in the final report. With one exception, the results are hypothetical. They get the name because the researchers fill in or dummies up, and the table will likely but fictitious data. And a research analyst can present dummy tables to the decision makers and ask, given the findings like this, will you be able to make a final decision? Yeah, if they say yes, the proposal may be accepted, but however, if the decision makers cannot see how results like those in the dummy tables will help them make the decision, it may be back to the drawing boards. So the client and the researcher need to rethink what the research results are necessary in order to solve that specific problem.